Okay, so let me tell you what the topic of today's talk is going to be, which is very much focused on productivity growth and its driver in the face of shocks. We have seen several in the last decades, but also a significant structural change. And here, you can think of the big changes that have happened thanks to the digital transformation, but also the societal challenges of climate change that are expecting us. Let me say that I'm heading the Productivity, Innovation and Entrepreneurship Division at the OECD, and the work that I'm discussing today really builds on the work that many colleagues have conducted, also as co-authors, and I'm happy to share any reference where you be interested in any particular topic. So why focusing on the micro drivers of productivity across countries? Let me start with the core of the subject. Why do we care about productivity and differences in productivity across countries and over time? First of all, because differences in multi-factor productivity, so how much output you can get out of a fixed level of inputs, is what can explain in the long run differences in aggregate income per capita across countries and ultimately well-being, and also how well-being have evolved over time. Obviously here a big role is driven by structural change. I mentioned digital transformation, in general technological change, but also skills, and I'm going to get to that during the presentation. And last but not least, policy, and the policy that drives the business environment also has an important role to play. And I hope to mention these again during the presentation. Two important points that I would like to make, and I will get back to this in a couple of slides, is that the aggregate productivity differences that we observe across countries are actually driven by the substantial heterogeneity that exists across different types of firms. So you can observe different across countries because they have, for example, a different composition of firms. You can think of sectoral, but think also of the size distribution, of the management distribution across different firms in the economy. And then the second big important driver here is that aggregate productivity is going to be explained not only by the heterogeneity of the different firms that make up the economy of a country, but also how much they can access in terms of resources, being it labor, being it capital. And this efficiency of resource allocation, think, for example, of a good skill match between workers and firms, will affect the aggregate performance at the country level. And this, when you look at it in a static sense, in a dynamic sense, there is going to be a change in resource allocation, which is partly driven also by a process of creative distraction. And so entry and exit also play an important role. Now, what have we seen in the last decades? And this is really what we're all worried about, because as I said, aggregate productivity growth drives the growth of our wages and our income per capita. We have observed a slowdown in aggregate productivity growth. And this aggregate slowdown has been accompanied by other, and in partly explained by other trends. The first one is an increase in productivity dispersion. So the differences that we observe across different firms has actually increased over time. We have also seen an increase in profit dispersion across firms, an increase in markup, i.e. the wedge between prices and marginal costs. And we have seen the rise of what many now call superstar firms that have actually gained increasingly market share, and we have seen an increase in industry concentration. Until a few years ago, we thought this was something that characterized more the US economy relative to European economies. And in fact, we have seen that even in Europe, we have seen this increase in industry concentration. And the other side of the coin is that we have seen a decline in business dynamism. And by declining business dynamism, I also mean a proxy for this process of creative destruction that I mentioned before. So we have seen a decline in entry rates, a decline of movement of workers across firms. So, you know, if there was a mismatch, this has probably remained there because workers don't move as much across employers as they used to. And we have seen what we call an entrenchment at the top. So if you were a firm and you made it to the top, it was much easier to get there 20 years ago than it is to get there today, because at the moment, the firms at the top remain there, especially amongst the digital sectors. And this is something that you know, has changed significantly since the year 2000. So just to give you like a better representation of what I just said, you know, you need to think of the slowdown in aggregate productivity growth being driven by two processes. One is slowdown of resource allocation that I mentioned, decline in business dynamism, rising concentration, and you know, the nature of this reallocation process, which probably isn't as productivity enhancing as it used to. And then on the other hand, we have seen a decline in this within firm growth of heterogeneous firm, of different firms. So while we see this growth of the superstar firms that are doing very well, we also see that the speed of catch up of the less productive firms has actually declined over time. What I'm going to show you is that there seems to be a clear and sort of consistent link of these processes with two structural factors: the rise of the intangible assets and the role that they have. Think of knowledge, think of R&D, think of innovation, think of management, combined with the faster digital transformation and the globalization. And then I'm going to discuss what policy can do to deal with these trends. So let me, you know, discuss the fact that the slowdown has been a long-standing debate. You know, since, you know, very shortly after the great financial recession, and you know, I think still to these days there isn't really, I would say, a common opinion. On the one hand, you have optimists that see this sort of decline in productivity growth as very much a temporary factor that will be reverted once the benefits, for example, of technology like AI will materialize. And so we will see what they call the J curve in aggregate productivity growth. And on the other hand, you have pessimists that, like Bob Gordon is probably the most famous one, who basically claimed that since the second industrial revolution, we haven't really seen any significant innovation that has led to a similar increase in productivity growth. What our studies here at the OECD have tried to bring to the debate is very much this issue that the pessimism that Gordon and Bryn-Jolfsson talk about, I think, focus very much on what's going on at the global frontier and much less about what we call the diffusion of these technologies across firms. And so we try to go underneath this sort of very focused view on frontier innovations. You know, Bob Gordon was thinking, you know, of the electrification of this kind of big innovation, but without really focusing on the diffusion. And once we do this, we see that those innovations actually have led to continue increasing in productivity. And you see here the blue line, the frontier productivity that has been stable and increasing, you know, since at least the 2000. But what has been falling behind is very much the productivity performance of lagging firms. So firms that are below the top decile of the productivity distribution. And so this is very much, you know, a potential explanation that puts together the, I would say, the optimism and the sort of lack of aggregate productivity growth. And as I said, you know, in addition to these, we see this slowdown in the process of creative destruction and the entrenchment of frontier firms. I mean, we have several results on these. Now, the explanation that we bring foremost very much the lack of this diffusion and the challenge for these laggard firms of catching up. Other explanation that I think are also compatible is the fact that there has been a winner takes most dynamics that is associated with some digital technologies that are sort of leading to network externalities. What I should say is when we look at the figure that I have on this graph is very much looking at a global economy, but this figure is very similar when we start looking within countries. And here on your left, you see in the market services, it's the dark blue bar, and the dotted blue bar is manufacturing. We see that on average across OECD countries, within country, we see an increase in productivity dispersion. And we see that this productivity dispersion is happening very much in the lower tail of the productivity distribution. So we see very much that there seems to be an element of lack of catching up or slowing down of catching up at the bottom of the distribution. Let me show you this. Sorry, because, okay. So let me give you some explanation why this is happening. You know, as I said, there are several. One is the rise of in the intangible economy and the role of the digital transformation. This might seem perhaps counterintuitive because we think of digital technologies are actually lowering entry cost. You know, is market penetration, is you know, knowledge sharing, because it's so easy. You know, I can talk to Daniel who is sitting you know, in another country at very low cost, low marginal cost. But what I think is more important for explaining these trends is the fact that, you know, for being able to use this digital technology, we need complementary investments, not only in capital, but also in, for example, skills, management, and organization. And we also see that some of these innovations come with very important tacit knowledge. So not everything is going to be written in a patent, not everything is written in a software. Where you need to adapt a software, you need to have those coding skills and that particular knowledge. And the other second element is because these intangible assets are also scalable. You know, there are large economies of scales, and therefore the marginal cost of, for example, writing yet again another piece of software are near zero, but the entry costs are very high. And why is this so important? Because it is these complementary skills, whether in management or STEM or other soft skills and intangible, that are very hard and very costly to accumulate. Think of talents that you need to hire. It's become quite costly. And this is particularly true for smaller and younger firms. So you really see that these constitute actually a barrier to entry in some new markets, while for the larger firms, they can gain more and more market share because it becomes less and less costly for them to develop a new piece, for example, of intangible assets, a new piece of code, think of that, but also they can apply higher markups because their marginal costs are continually decreasing the more they produce. Now, this is one potential explanation. The literature has many, and I put them up here. You know, I'm not going to all the detail. I'm happy to talk about them. One mention that I would like to say, and I mean, we might get back to that. There are some factors where I think at the beginning of COVID, we thought, oh, these things might change. Actually, it seems that they're likely to be amplified by COVID and probably amplified also by the current energy crisis and the high energy prices that we are seeing. So this is very much something that I think is not going to change in the future, in the near future, this slowing down and this increase in dispersion. So one thing that I mentioned several times, and I just want to show you with real numbers here, is that this increase in productivity dispersion has been accompanied by an increase that is larger, an increase in dispersion that is larger in more digital intensive firms. So the more we are digitalizing, for example, with COVID, the more we are likely to see this increase in dispersion between we call the best and the rest, between the frontier firms and the rest. And in this figure, you see very much that, especially when we think about services sector and this ICT producing services, you see very much that there is an increase of dispersion even amongst the top firms. So you really have the superstar firms effect that we were mentioning before. Now, what's happening on the other side of the coin is that we see, again, related to knowledge and to intangible assets and ICT intensity, we see very much that laggards are actually, the rest of the firm, the bottom of the distribution, the very small, very low productivity firms have actually a much harder time. And here you see the speed of catch up is on the figure on your right in green, the green bar. You see that the speed of catch up is actually lower in high digital intensive sector, high skill intensive sector, high knowledge intensive sector. So you really see that there is a trend going on here. Every time we look at high intangible intensity, we see a harder time for lagging firms. Now, I mentioned several times the fact that there is a problem of catching up. And we talked about potential explanation that lie, if you want, in structural factor outside the firm. We talked about the digital transformation. We talked about globalization very quickly. But there is also an element of heterogeneity and potential explanation that comes from within the firm. And in particular, on what we call the human side of productivity. So part of this complementary investment that could help firms to win the race and to sort of really succeed in an era of digital transformation comes from having the right skills, the right management, the right cultural diversity. Now, there is a lot of literature on these topics, but there is very little cross-country evidence. And the main reason is really about the fact that there isn't a lot of evidence and a lot of data that allows this type of study. So this is something that the OECD has contributed to. And we have data that comes from what we call the PIAC database, and we measure skills coming from this database. Now, what do we find? And this is particularly important, I think, to understand the importance and the link, I would say, between skills and productivity. We see that the frontier firms are actually those firms that are also hiring the highest share of high-skilled workers, a similar share of medium-skilled workers, but a much lower share of low-skilled workers. So, in a way, skills, productivity, and wages really go hand in hand, even just because of this distribution of skills across firms. Now, let me say that when we think about skills, often we think of educational attainment. Absolutely. There are differences, and we develop a measure of skill distance across different firms. So there is for sure a difference in the distribution of educational attainment. But again, I think the biggest difference is across different firms, along the productivity distribution. So the biggest difference between the superstar firms, the best firms, and the rest is very much on the management and communication skills and beyond the ICT skills. So these are the specific skills where smaller companies that are sort of lagging behind in terms of productivity should actually invest if they want to succeed in the digital transformation. Why do I think that this is particularly important? Because our studies show that about 30% of the overall gap between the best performing firms and the lowest performing firms, of the median performing firms, can actually be explained by differences in the workforce composition, so in this human side. And here we include skills, managerial structure, but also gender and cultural diversity. So this is something that policies can do a lot to change and to improve. this is also important because in the last 20 years, and this is what we report here, the difference in terms of, like I would say, selection of high-skilled workers into high-performing firms has significantly increased across countries. And you see here, Sweden is also amongst those countries where this I would say selection of high-skilled worker in high-performing firms has increased over the last 20 years quite significantly, and the share of low and medium has declined. So again, this is somewhere where policy can do a lot. Let me now go, we went within firms, let me go across firms now, because as I told you from the beginning, there are these two sides of the coins that explain aggregate productivity growth. And let me tell you about the slowing down of relocation forces. We have seen a significant decline in entry rate. This is something that was first found for the US, but it has been found across OECD economies. And our study has also shown that this decline has been particularly strong in digital intensive sectors. And these are, the sectors where I said we see some sort of entrenchment at the top and some barriers to entry being faced by newcomers because of these intangible assets. We see that there has been, a decline in entry rate. Sorry, I wanted to highlight Sweden, I highlighted Italy. And you see that there has been, again, a decline in digital intensive sector and other sectors. And here you see, before and after the crisis. Now, let me go we see what's happening in entry rate. Let's see what's happening in concentration. We see an increase in concentration, across Europe. And I should say this is, less strong than in the US, but still significantly strong. And you see that this is happening across the economy. In about 2/3 of all sectors in economy, we see an increase in concentration, both in manufacturing and in the services sector. And we see that this increase in concentration is actually being much, much stronger for sectors that are more intensive in the use of intangible assets. And this you see on your right. Now, let me go to the COVID-19 and let me tell you what's happening during COVID and why I think that some of these trends that I showed you are actually going to remain. So one thing that is important to mention is that during COVID, it's a bit hard to understand what's going on exactly during COVID to productivity because, output declined, but hours work declined by a larger amount. And so we see like almost a mechanic increase in labor productivity. And we also see that the output actually declined much more in less productive sectors. I should say here, think of restaurants and hotels that are normally, entertaining low productive sectors. They are the one that saw a stronger decline in GDP, in output, and therefore you see this automatic increase in labor productivity. We also see very strong differences in entry rates, where we have countries where there is a V-type shaped recovery, very strong entry rates coming mainly from online retail. This is particularly the case for the UK, the US, and the Netherlands. And you see other countries, and I mean, the strongest case is very much Italy, but also Spain and Portugal, I should say, where you have an L-type recovery. So we have seen a decline in entry rate, and it didn't really catch up relative to the pre-COVID era. I should say that these are data that we collected during COVID with colleagues, and now we have an ongoing project that, you can find this data online. We started collecting this timely, real data on entry rates more consistently. Now, good news regarding COVID, let's try to be positive on this, but it should be said that there has been a huge and sudden increase in digital adoption across countries. Everyone was forced to telework, and I'm going to get to that in a minute. And in fact, what we see is that when we look at investment by tangibility of assets, this is what I'm showing you in this figure, you see very much that the investment in intellectual property products, which is the name for intangible assets, actually increased and didn't see a decline during COVID. So there was very much a resilience of this type of intangible, which is good news, I would say, also for the future. So dispersion might continue to increase, as I mentioned before, but at least everyone might have raised a bit, what I would like to call raise the tide. So everyone has invested more in intangible assets. Here is some data that we did, we did ourselves for Italy. We have a study that really focuses on the digital gap in Italy. And you see that, firms really increase their investment. Data for other countries, we don't have yet, but we hope to have in the next couple of years. Let me also give you the bad news, which is one where this digital adoption in a way saw a lot of cash going to the large players in the market. And therefore, we have also seen a strong acceleration in acquisitions by the large digital firms. I should say that this is the only sector for which acquisitions increased during COVID. And so, the trend in concentration that we had seen already after the first great financial crisis might continue to increase. So it's not good news if we think that mergers and acquisition is a proxy for changes in concentration. Let me now go to the telework during COVID, because I think that has been, as I said, another good news for us in terms of what was going on during COVID. We see that since the beginning of the pandemic, and in particular, in combination with the government restrictions that many countries have implemented, we have seen an increase in the adoption of telework, but also, and this is what I'm showing you in this figure, in jobs that have now become teleworkable. So in a way, we see that firms, when they post a job ad, they allow jobs to be teleworkable. So there is already, and I'm going to get back to this, we see already that there is almost an expectation by firms that more and more jobs are now teleworkable, and they were not teleworkable before. Why this is important for productivity, and again, I'm going to try to go very quickly to that, but for sure during COVID, it increased resilience. We use what we call potential capital. There is a very nice paper by Eberle, Haskell, and Meisen on this. There is evidence that show that at the aggregate level, productivity is increasing because of savings due to lower commuting costs. And from a survey that we did ourselves, we really see that there has been a stigma of telework that has been broken, and now there are expectations that there is this hybrid mode of working, which might allow, for example, for more flexibility, might allow for better matching, because firms can sort of open up the talent pool to a larger extent. But there is also a negative side, because when people don't go to work, they might, especially if they telework too much, they might sort of feel detached from the firm, so they lose the corporate identity. They might also lose, find it more difficult to communicate with their management and with their workers. They might feel more lonely. And one other important element, which perhaps hasn't been seen yet, but in the longer run, the fear is that innovation might be penalized, because some of these, chats that you have during coffee breaks or at the water fountain, coffee machine, all of this has been lost. And so some of the ideas and some of the team building that is needed in knowledge-intensive sectors is actually lost. And this is within the firm. And let me also mention that if you think of cities, that's where a lot of our innovation and our knowledge creation is happening. If firms move out of cities and don't move in the office anymore, some of these agglomeration economies and these positive externalities might also be lost. And there are other consequences, which I don't know if I have time to get to, but obviously there is an issue with inequalities, loss of jobs in auxiliary services. Think of the bars and the little dry cleaners next to offices that don't have, clients as they used to. So again, there might be issues for the, low-skilled occupation in these auxiliary services. We've collected new evidence, and again, you can find all of these online. The idea was very much not only to gather information of the changes between the pre and during COVID, but also to think of expectations. And I think here, let me also thank, Swedish colleagues and trade unions, because that's also how through TUAC and through BIAC, the business association, we've got responses also from Sweden. So as I said, one of the things we really wanted to get to, because I think this is what will indicate that there is a structural change going on, is whether telework is here to stay. And here the idea is very much that there was a positive experience with COVID, and the higher the positive experience, the more countries would want to continue to telework. Here I should say, and you see Sweden in the bottom part of the graph, Sweden actually had relatively high telework already before COVID, and so perhaps is one country where the change hasn't been as dramatic as in other countries. Let me mention Germany, but other like Greece and the US. Now, we also see through our studies that especially countries that have high broadband penetration, so high quality of the internet, is that there is an element of continuation. So we don't expect telework to disappear once the whole crisis period is over. And in fact, we see that especially in countries with good internet connection, telework is here to stay. So this is something that comes through several of our studies. And you see that this is true also in manufacturing, where the level of telework is obviously much lower than in knowledge-intensive services for obvious reason. Like it's much easier to telework in an office job than when you need to assemble a machine. But still, there is some telework that will continue also after COVID. Let me also tell you from our study, but Bloom and co-authors find a similar number. The sweet spot here is very much 2 to 3 days a week. Why is this important? Let me just mention very quickly what I mentioned before. We find actually through our data that the link with productivity is not monotonously increasing, but actually there are improvements in telework for low level of telework, where people can focus, their well-being is improving, there are more concentration, less commuting. But then if telework is too much, then you start losing the benefits from telework. And in fact, in our data, we see that the sweet spot is actually, again, 2 to 3 days a week is exactly what we find also in our data. And again, you find this in our working paper. I want to go, and then this is the last thing I want to touch upon, is global value chain. Why do I want to talk about this? Because I think really COVID and the invasion of Ukraine by Russia has been, the two big shocks, I think, to our economies. And to me, two important changes. One is, the telework and the digital adoption that I mentioned. And now, and these had already started with COVID and the disruption of global value chain with China and their zero COVID policy, which is still, going on, but also this kind of, realization that we might depend too much on very few countries and very few what we call choke points. So being China, being Russia, and so on. So, think of, a big change by Paul Krugman. Paul Krugman, used to say, this is the greatest thing that we could have had, slicing up the value chain. This is how we benefit from, trade. This is how we can increase overall productivity. And then, you know, with time, Krugman sort of sees this declining globalization, but he also sees that, you know, the world is becoming more and more what he calls a dangerous place. So you see that even amongst the economists, there is a realization that things perhaps haven't gone the way we wanted. And, you know, as I said, this supply disruption, which started, you know, with COVID, but, you know, continued, you know, with the war, you know, can raise concern. And this disruption can happen upstream. Think of it as, you know, the supply that we needed from China. In the past, we had accidents where, for example, supplying of parts component from Japan were also like disrupted. But it might also be a demand shock. So the demand shock, think of it also of COVID, where, you know, for example, you know, let me mention the Italian export to like of luxury goods to the US was actually very strongly disrupted because of COVID. So think of it also during COVID of the shortage of masks and medical equipment and so on. So you really see that there has been this big debate, you know, should we depend on, for example, just the US as our large market as customers, or should we depend only on China for the supply of our, you know, medical equipment, and in particularly masks. Now, one important element that has come out from a study that we presented recently at our committee, and you know, really sees the fact that, again, it depends very much where the shock comes from, and how much the shock comes from countries that are the sole supplier, or very much the supplier, the demand is very much concentrated to this one suppliers and customer, and also whether there is the industry concentration that I showed you before. And we see that actually the shocks, the negative shocks, both from the supply and the demand side, are particularly sort of damaging when the supply or the demand are highly concentrated, both geographically and in terms of, you know, industry concentration. This is what you see here, both upstream and downstream in the yellow line. So you see that, you know, the shocks, when they come from highly concentrated industry and highly concentrated value chain to particular what we call choke points, you know, they are much more persistent and much more negative impact. Sorry, not the yellow line, the blue line, apologies. Yeah. So let me also mention what are these choke points with data that we develop in-house through the international input-output tables that we provide, and they are available online. We also have indicators such as STIVA that many of you might be familiar with, but we develop new indicators, and we can identify choke points. And let me tell you, in many cases, especially in manufacturing, these choke points are very much large countries. Unsurprisingly, upstream in terms of supplying is China, Germany, and the US, but this is also true for demand downstream choke points. But when we think of other, and this is an important point, when we think of mining or agriculture, these choke points actually, especially when we think upstream, can actually be some very small resource-rich countries. And you know, think of Kazakhstan, but also Norway or Vietnam. So you really see that sometimes we are very dependent on very small countries. So let me close the presentation with just a few points on for policymakers. You know, I hope I convince you that one of the main problems of the productivity slowdown is this diffusion of knowledge. So one policy action is very much to facilitate the diffusion of knowledge from the global frontier to the national frontier, but also, you know, to these lagging firms that are really struggling to catching up. And the other side of the coin is very much to reallocate the resources to the most productive firm, and so facilitate this reallocation And here, let me also stress the importance of skill, diminish the skill mismatch that might exist, and so facilitate mobility of workers. So you really need to allocate this human capital effectively. And here, policy has a very important role to play. And on diffusion, you can think of these not only in terms of policy for innovation, but also policies that concern management and that concern skills. And that I know that you're very much concerned about inclusive growth. I think skills and management are two important points. So I'm saying the same thing here. Let me stress, and we discussed this before the seminar with Daniel, every country does industrial policy. We just need to do it well and recognize that we do it, and combine demand and supply side policies, and really trying to think of policies that can give you double dividends. So I think, as I mentioned, skills and business dynamism are two elements. So again, I don't want to go too much in detail, but I think, on the one hand, and I mentioned this for telework, good telecommunication infrastructure, but also the business environment to reduce barrier to entry, and it's particularly important. I'm not going to go into detail, but let me, 2 main points on telework. We used to say that, telework was not possible. The stigma has been broken now. So I think policy has an important role to play to enable telework and to empower both workers and organizations to do this, but also to protect workers. This is something that is becoming more important, a right to disconnect and also regulate. So in terms of global value chain, I think, again, we discussed this with Daniel, you cannot do nearshoring everywhere, especially in the short term. But I think there is an element of a strategic approach to global value chain where government can really focus on either facilitate agility ex ante and adaptation ex post. In terms of agility ex ante, diversification is one element that I think is going to affect a lot of sectors. And then for the more strategic sector, I think, we need to really have a more active policy of risk mitigation, where, one important element needs to be technological innovation. So we need to start thinking how, for example, one might want to think of different raw materials, like whether we can change the use and the combination of raw materials. Think of also renewables so that we don't depend on gas and oil. And so let me stop here. I mean, I could have talked about many more things that the division works about. We didn't have time, and we really need to think of this new industrial policy that we were mentioning with Daniel before the talk. Let me stop here.
Many thanks to you, Chiara, for a very informative and structured presentation. I have a few questions more based on the presentations. Then I have more broader questions. So I'll start with some of the more narrow ones. And the first one is, when you say that we are in a period of lower productivity growth, you compared to decades ago, like 60s and 70s, and then we have going down a bit. But do you see the financial crisis as a new step, or is it like a continuation of this downtrend?
No, I mean, let me say, I mean, the comparison was, I think, with the late 90s, where you really saw a big, I would say, boom in productivity growth, also thanks to the digital transformation. Yeah. I think that the crisis, the 2008 crisis, worsened things, and in particular, I would say there are two reasons for this. One is that there hasn't been a lot of cleansing during the financial crisis, because it was a financial crisis, and we actually saw what we call a missing generations of startup, with obviously implication for what we discussed in terms of creative destruction. So this is something that thankfully, in many countries, not all, we haven't seen to the same extent during COVID. Now, this could be potentially for the support that has been given during COVID that we didn't see during the crisis, but also is a very different, the nature of the crisis was very different during COVID. It was not a financial crisis, it was a real supply and demand crisis. So I think, to me, the financial crisis did constitute, as you say, an additional step in making things worse.
Oh, okay. Yeah, then understand. And on top of that, you have this market concentration, as you mentioned, and the growing markups, especially among the superstar firms, I guess you mean.
Yeah.
But what happens to these profits if they're not going into new investments, to new productivity? Couldn't that be argument for more investments and more productivity with such dynamic firms making investments for the future?
Okay. Let me try to answer the question, because it's a bit of a tricky question. So, I mean, for sure, I should say that the markups increased a lot for few firms, for the superstar firms, and in particular for digital superstar firms. Yeah. So what happens to this profit? Some of them have been reinvested. I mean, these firms do invest in R&D. Sorry. But, obviously they have also benefited from, higher returns to their investments. So, dividends and so on. Yeah. So, I haven't really looked at that, what firms do with their profits. So I cannot answer your question precisely, but for sure, for example, wages of top management. I mean, there are like several studies that have seen a huge increase of the salaries of top management, returns to capital investment. So I think you see some of these things. So not all of it, I think, has been reinvested. Some of it has.
Okay. Very good. Because that's also the discussion coming into this decoupling issue in many countries where the productivity growth has not been translated into real wage growth. That's not the case in the Nordic countries, most likely, but in other countries. So I think, is it the case that, like Acemoglu discusses, that we have too much of a financialization? So when the rewards of productivity is not distributed to the workers in the same extent, they go to unproductive issues. Is that what you are saying? Like, not everything is investment for future?
I mean, that might be part of the story. I think, there is also a different issue, which is, again, I think connected to what I showed you in the presentation, which is the selection of high-skilled, high-paid worker in more productive firms. And so, this increased divergence in productivity, you also see it happening in wages. So you see that part of the increase in wage inequality is actually, connected to the increase in productivity dispersion. So, in a way, having an increase in productivity, especially amongst the lower productive firms, is actually going to be beneficial for wage inequality. Then obviously there is, the question not only of, let's say, wage inequality, but inequality overall. And there, I think the whole question of profits and how they're distributed, that plays surely a role. But, I think, most of a big part of inequality is wage inequality. And that actually is where I think having, not only the superstar, but in particular having this better catch up of the lower productivity firm and increase their productivity could actually be beneficial.
Yes. Yeah, okay. Very good. If I continue this superstar firm trajectory, is it that those firms that are suppliers to these big, very productive firms, do they also become more productive, kind of being part of the same production process?
So, I mean, two things on this, and I didn't show any of that, but we actually did a study with with a Japanese colleague, a Japanese professor, so looking at Japan. So for sure, I think there is an element of spillovers within value chain, and there is a large literature emerging, especially, I would say, from the whole multinational perspective. So if you are suppliers of customers of multinational, and from the developing country perspective. So for sure, being part of a value chain with a very productive firm might be beneficial in terms of knowledge spillovers.
Yeah.
You need to have what we call absorptive capacity. So you need to have the skills of the manager that allow you to benefit from this knowledge spillover. That's one condition. But then we have seen that in some countries, being in a value chain with a very, I would say, powerful and you know, a large superstar firm who has a large share of the market might put you in a difficult position in terms of having, you know, not only a monopolist, but actually a monopsonist. And so that is where I think being in a value chain, and that's where diversification is important, you know, and we see that in some countries, you know, I'm not going to name names, but there are some large large countries where you have some very large players and many small suppliers actually then risk to have this dual economy that firms and workers of these large multinationals or large conglomerates do extremely well. And then you have those in the smaller companies that have to accept conditions that might not be necessarily beneficial for them or for their workers. So that's, I think, a note of caution on the superstar firms and being in a value chain with the superstar firms. We have seen it happening during the crisis where, you know, let me mention large supermarkets didn't pay their suppliers because they wanted to survive themselves during COVID. And then, you know, they put the smaller supplier in a very difficult financial position, you see, and they could do it because obviously you didn't want to lose a large customer. So we have to be a bit careful on that. I mean.
Oh, thank you. I have also this related questions on you talk about the intangibles, like a new kind of a production factor becoming more important. But many of these intangibles are measured as intermediates and not as part of the capital stock. Does it mean that the capital stock has become relatively less important for productivity growth because more coming from the intangibles?
That's a very good question. So let me mention two things. So there are some intangibles that are actually being capitalized in national accounts, in particular R&D and software now. There are many intangibles that are not even measured. And here I'm talking about organizational capital, management, and competencies, really. So this is something where I think we are attributing a lot of the productivity growth to MFP, multi-factor productivity, which is a measure of our ignorance. And so for sure, you know, we are missing out in terms of measurement, the role of intangibles. And yes, it is true that I think, you know, it might be the case that the role of the contribution of physical capital to aggregate productivity growth might be underestimated relative to the role that we give to MFP. Okay. You know, but you know, there is also an element of correlation between physical and intangible capital. So the extent of the bias has to be, you know, estimated, and you know, we have no proper numbers to do that yet. Okay.
Yeah, that brings me further into the mismatch, the measure of ignorance. I mean, almost all European countries, as I have seen, have a big gap between the skills on the market and the demand from the firms. It seems to be a general pattern, and we try in Sweden to do something about it on the adult level. But how can it be that we have such a mismatch? Doesn't the market signals match? What is the reason behind this? Because you lose productivity. I mean,
yeah. I mean, the reason might be many, and I mean, I'm not an expert in this area, but let me mention a few. One is mobility. So, you know, often, especially for women, you know, you live somewhere, you know, not because of your job, you live somewhere because of your family and so on. So that's already one reason. The second one is, again, availability of job in the place where you live. You know, you might be a nuclear scientist, but if you don't have a nuclear plant where you live, either you move or so. Mobility, I think, is a big element. The second one is also so mobility and opportunities, I should say. The second is that sometimes, and you know, there is a change in production and the change in the skills that are needed, and there isn't the right training to adapt the worker to the change skill demand. And so, you know, you're not adapting the supply of skills to the demand. And then finally, you know, there is, I think, a general concern that the skills that you find, you know, provided by the university, by the school, are not exactly the skill that you need in the labor force, in you know, in the productive, let's say, part of the economy. So that's a bit, I would say, the three main reasons, you know.
Yeah, okay. Because that was one of the I think, for the trade union side, one of the most important topics you discussed was this, it's not only about your formal education, it's about the skills and what you can do at work. Yeah. And maybe high education is a very expensive signal to show your competence. Yeah. Maybe you can find it more cheaply by doing it at work sometimes. But in Sweden, we have a new system where we try to, the social partners has negotiated a new adult system for learning. So the government is now trying to impose a new system for education during your work life. And that is kind of I would say, a progressive way to try to reduce the skills mismatch for those already at work, but it doesn't hit those that are outside work now.
I agree.
So it's two kind of different topics here, I think, somewhat, for those inside and those outside. And the labor market policy, I don't know, you're not an expert on that, maybe. But,
not so much.
No.
We have a whole directorate at OECD that is expert in labor market policy. So, but I think training is one important area, and I think, you know, I should say that given the studies that we have done, training at any age and of any worker is actually, you know, can only be beneficial to productivity. For sure, it cannot do any harm.
No, absolutely not. Also, you grow as a human, you learn more.
Yeah, no, and there have been significant changes. I think, you know, even just the telework, I mean, you really see an age difference in terms of, you know, the capacity to adapt. So having training is actually very useful.
Yeah. Okay, very good. This kind of more questions related to what you directly said. So now I broaden the picture a little bit. And I start with a kind of a philosophical question. When I study your productivity indicator database on GDP per hour, I can see that Denmark is on 87, France is on 80, EU is on 80, Austria in 76. So we are very close. The rich countries are very close. Yeah. So in 4 out of 7 of the richest countries in terms of GDP per hour is the Nordic countries. Yeah. And we are not supposed to be that productive in a basic sense. But how can it be that we are so narrow each other between countries? Yeah, start with that one.
Okay, so first of all, I mean, you have to think of the fact that being narrow, you know, in practice might still mean, you know, being different in terms of, you know, real wages. And I mean, you know, productivity, you know, measure in terms of level is not productivity growth. So, you know, in terms of having high wages, I think we would agree that across Europe, we are all kind of, especially you mentioned some of the Nordic countries. I think, the similarity, I agree, is there. I mean, there has been a sort of convergence also in terms of institution during the last decade. So I think that is important. I think it's less the case for Southern European countries.
Yeah.
But I think the biggest difference is not only in the levels, it's very much in the growth. And that's where you really see, I would say, different, big differences even across European countries and countries. I mean, let me mention Belgium, because I looked at Belgium in more detail. Belgium, for example, is a country with very high levels of productivity, but very low productivity growth. So in terms of consequences for well-being, they are still, worrying, because you can have high wages, but then if over time you cannot accumulate resources to pay people's wages, then you have a problem for the new generation. So you might do very well, but your children might have issues paying your salaries and their own salaries. So I think this is something that we should not forget. Yeah. So as I said, being on the same level, yes, I would, in terms of productivity growth, I think the picture is a bit more heterogeneous.
Yeah, okay. But do you have an idea why Belgium is falling down relatively in terms of growth rates?
I mean, the explanation, again, productivity is driven by so many factors that, there isn't only one thing. Yeah. I mean, obviously, one issue is one of dynamism. So, the entry and the growth of new firms is actually, an issue, for example, in Belgium, but and again, the catch-up of the lagging firms is another thing that is becoming more and more of an issue across not only Belgium, but several countries. So it's very much this dynamic, the improvement and the, coming both from what we call the extensive margin, the entry rates, but also coming from the growth of existing firms that are not performing so well. Okay. And so that is what is going to cause a problem in the longer run.
Yeah. Okay, very good then. I wrote a paper from the Productivity Institute in the UK recently, where they argued that we need a new measure on productivity, which includes we deduct the environmental harm and we add the investments in a better environment. So are you thinking about kind of measure why the numerator in a different way?
So the OECD has had work trying to include the use of natural resources in terms of capital, like the natural capital. And the Statistics and Data Directorates of the OECD has done a lot of work on this. We are starting new work to understand whether better productivity can go hand in hand with lower emissions. Yeah. And again, you were mentioning spillovers before. We're actually looking at this in two ways. One is looking again at the distribution and trying to understand where, if you want, policy can have an impact in terms of improving the emissions and investing in higher productivity. And again, first results that we have developed looking at couple of countries, so it's still not a fully fledged cross-country analysis, but we see that the most productive firms actually are also the ones that are more energy efficient. Okay. So again, they probably invest in the latest technologies, new capital, and so on. And like you see that especially smaller firms are the ones that have a harder time being low emitters. The second questions that we wanted to look at is whether we could see that the low sort of high energy efficient firms, where they were positioned along the value chain. So we have focused on Estonia because we have the data for Estonia for now. And so we look at the domestic value chain and wanted to see whether the high energy efficient firms were, let's say, at the core of the value chain or they were peripheral. And what we find again is that those firms that are most energy efficient are actually at the core of the value chain. So the hope is that through knowledge spillovers, this capacity of using technologies that are energy efficient actually can spill over along the value chain. And so that's, in a way, again, speaks for action in terms of improving the network, spreading in a way this technology through the network. And I hope that this is something that, can happen, this learning by interacting.
Yeah.
So that's something that I agree we need to think of. One way of looking at it is looking at emissions. There are quite a few data sources to do that. Another one is to look at energy usage. And there again, some countries are better than others. But for sure, it's going to be a challenge, I think, to do this fully fledged change in considering, how much you invest in emitting less and how much pollution you produce. At the firm level is going to take a long time to get to a fully fledged, new measure of productivity that takes into account this. But I think there are already some data that can allow us to at least get an understanding of what is going on.
Yeah, perfect. Another more maybe philosophical question is inclusive growth issue. And in your 2015 report on the future productivity, OECD was talking about income differences, social mobility, everybody should have a chance to become what they want. Yeah. Is that part of your general framework, or was that more of a one-time shot, or?
No. I mean, I think that motivates quite a lot of our work. We actually finished in 2021 a report that looked at the role of firms for wage inequality. And I think, that paper was very much in line and as part of this view of inclusive growth. And so, I mentioned this already, how both the human side of productivity project and these projects looking at the role of firm of wage inequality was really, I would say, trying to really highlight the link between better productivity and better wages, and better productivity and better opportunity, and how the two are interlinked. And it's very hard to say what is causing what. We didn't get that far, and it's a bit of a chicken and egg problem. But I think this was really very much part of this inclusive growth perspective. The second, which we didn't talk about this now, but we have done work together with UNICEF, for example, trying to look at the role of global value chains and how, in a way, sometimes we import, like child labor, let's say, from less developed economies, and sort of raise these to the attention of countries. And we actually did a report last year on industrial policy for sustainable development goals. And I believe that this all improving the inclusiveness along the value chain, whether it's on gender, whether it's on child labor, whether it's on opportunities, health, and so on, can really happen along the value chain. And this is something that I think there hasn't been a lot of work yet on how to do this also in terms of policy. And I think there is a lot of debate as well, because it's hard to hold responsible a firm in Sweden for what's going on in Bangladesh. It's hard for the firms to do that. So there are some measures and some regulation, but I think there is still a lot of debate on how far we can go.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you very much for that. I have a few questions, but we are soon running out of time. So I have one broad question for you left. And I wonder if you want to say something before we close up, which we should have said, I should have asked. But I'll continue with the last question first. You divided the pessimism against the positivists, positive and negative. Gordon versus Brynjolfsson. And I kind of understood that you are more on the Brynjolfsson side. Was that correct? Or can you elaborate a bit on that?
I think you are correct in the sense that I do believe that there is a very strong potential coming from technology. I would say I also disagree with the view that, artificial intelligence and digital technology will lead to substitution of workers. We don't find any evidence on that. I think, this kind of fear of technological unemployment has gone on since, the Luddites and Keynes and so on, and we haven't seen any of that. So I remain positive on that. Where I do remain pessimist, and that's where, as I said, we've done several reports, because I do believe it's important, is the fact that without the right policies, we might see inequality increases. And these right policies need to act both on the sort of business dynamic side of the story, so competition policies, regulation, protection of consumers, which we haven't discussed, but I think is the other side of what we discussed today. This whole role of large suppliers, small customers, and vice versa. I think that's another element where I think policy needs to act. And then the second element is very much one of skills, and we touched upon today, because I think if you don't have the right distribution of skills and opportunity, this inequality will continue, and that I think government can play an important role. So I'm a pessimist because sometimes I think policy should spend more in certain area, and we talk a lot, but I mean, just to tell you, like a silly thing that to me matters a lot, we still don't measure training properly. So if we don't measure training properly, how can we do it properly? Another thing where we are doing a lot of work right now is we don't know how much countries are spending on industrial policies. So how can you say industrial policy works or doesn't work? So at the moment, we are doing a lot of work collecting data on quantifying industrial strategy in a comparative way, so the country understand, okay, listen, perhaps I'm not spending enough on skills, I'm not supporting enough the digital transformation, the green transformation. But at the moment, we don't really know because we don't measure it. And I think training to me is one area where a lot more should be done. We all talk about this. We all say, oh, long life learning, but then we don't know how much anyone is doing and on what curricula. And so that's one area where I feel very strongly and a bit negatively about we should do more.
Just one follow-up question on that. Your focus on industrial policy now and trying to measure it, is it driven by the developments within EU and US, China, kind of understand the contemporary world?
I think it's very much driven by try to understand the temporary worlds. It's also driven by the fact that when COVID hit, we were asked by country, but how much are we spending already? Where are we spending? And I realized nobody really knew. And I think it's also driven by the fact that there is this, I think, still this wrong belief that industrial policy is not done by everyone. Everyone does industrial policy, and the industrial policy is bad. And I think, for example, Dani Rodrik, I know, has this new work on this new industrial policy for better jobs. Yes. I think more generally, I mean, industrial policy to face the societal challenges, climate change, and climate neutrality, net zero, and so on. I think, we will need industrial policy for coordinating, for supporting, for changing. So I think, we will need it, and we just need to do it well. So evaluation is another big area where I'm a big believer, and where I'm not always positive because we don't do enough. And the second one, as I said, is measurement of these things and talking about how it is done, comparing experiences, trying to figure out what works and what doesn't work, I think is an important element of industrial policy, and changing industrial policies when they don't work, which is another big problem. Nobody wants to let go of their own little program.
Exactly. And when you have it on place, you don't want to get rid of it. Even if it doesn't work. So that's where I think the whole policy cycle and the role of evaluation is particularly important, to really adapt and change and keep what works and get rid of what doesn't work. It's not easy. Is it a way to make the programs not perpetual, but just cut them for years and do evaluations and kind of keep track more closely? I think that's, we cannot do this at the OECD because, we see it at a much more macro level, but I think it is important for country to
adapt and change. You know, we don't need to tinker with everything all the time, because that leads to a lot of uncertainty, which is not good. But at the same time, I mean, what I've seen in some countries, and again, I'm not going to name names, but I've had like direct experience of advice with few countries that had hundreds and hundreds of support policies for SMEs, just to mention one. I mean, it's even hard for a small entrepreneur or a small business owner to navigate to all these support policies. So at the end, you were being counterproductive, because you had an information overflow for someone who is sometimes not the best manager or has to deal with like surviving every day. And so at the end, they wouldn't benefit from the support. And similarly for startup, you know, it's better to have well advertised, good and efficient programs than having 500, none of them really working properly. So I think there is an element also of, I don't know, restructuring and really making policy more effective, even from that point of view. You know, sometimes less is better than having too
less
many.
Is more.
Yeah, less is more, exactly.
Okay, perfect. Okay, then, do you have any questions or that I should have asked, or?
No, I think you asked a lot of quite tough questions that made me think as well. So thank you for that. And, you know, sorry for the connection for the Facebook, but we managed nevertheless. So thank you for that as well.
Yeah, we cut now. We cut, but can you stay for a minute outside?
Yes, yes.
Okay. Thank you for today, and we'll see you in the spring with this future of these webinars. Thank you. So.